Welcome to 20Q, 20 questions with interesting people, where we learn the origin stories of everyday superheroes in the LGBT community and friends. I am your host, the very handsome Tim Kirk, and our guest this time is raconteur, bon vivant, and man about town, Dr. Loren A. Olson. Loren?
Are you recording this, Tim?
Yes, I am.
I have never had an introduction like that, but I appreciate it anyhow, even if it's all bullshit.
So would you like me to go start? I'll start and do that again, okay?
Oh, okay.
Okay, we are here. We are talking. Hey, everybody. Welcome to 20Q, 20 questions with interesting people, where we learn the origin stories of everyday superheroes in the LGBT community and friends. I am your host, the very handsome Tim Kirk, and our guest this time is raconteur, bon vivant, and man about town, Dr. Loren A. Olson. Hi, Loren.
Hi, how are you, Tim?
Hi, it's great to be with you today.
I'm embarrassed and excited for the introduction.
You can tell how humble and modest I am.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to jump right into it. I'm going to start off a little bit about your background. Where are you originally from, and what was it like?
Well, I grew up in northeast Nebraska in a town of about 1,000 people. It was largely Northern European immigrant community, so it was mostly Scandinavian and German. And the town was about 90% Lutheran. So everybody looked alike, thought alike, and believed the same thing. And there was the only diversity we had was we had one Jew in town.
Wow.
Yeah. But he became a Lutheran later in life, and everybody celebrated that day. So it was there was not a lot of difference in the way people thought about things, and it was a very self-contained world.
Oh, that's very interesting. I actually knew someone from Kansas who got involved with me in employee resource group, and he first thing he said to me when he met me was, "What church do you go to?"
Uh-huh.
And that was the assumption. Being from Kansas, his whole family worked in or for the military, and they all were all churchgoers. And being a New Yorker, that's not generally the first question that people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you'd been in Waco, it would have been, which Lutheran church do you go to?
That would be a little bit more, I guess.
Yeah, there were 5 Lutheran churches within about 10-mile radius of that little town. Yeah, it was. And then from after I finished high school there, I went to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln for my pre-medical work, and it was really very much the same thing. There was a little more diversity, but still not a lot. The biggest social issue at the time was whether or not a black man could pledge a white fraternity. That was during the 60s, and it was fairly controversial. And then I went to medical school, and at that time we had one black man in the whole medical school, one Asian man, and in my class, there were 8 women, which was the most women that had been in any medical school class at the time that I started medical schools. So it was quite a different time. And part of what I did, Tim, was when I went back and I was doing the research for Finally Out, I wanted to try and recreate the world that I lived in and why it took me so long to figure out I was gay. And as I did that, I began to realize that there was a very monolithic kind of community that I lived in, grew up in.
Wow. I guess, and you stayed in Nebraska, and you didn't stray far from home, I imagine.
Well, after I finished medical school, then it was during the Vietnam era, and I knew that I was going to have to go into the military, so I went into the Navy and spent 4 years. Of course, at that time, the Navy wasn't exactly a terribly diverse community either, and I spent my time the first year doing flight physicals on candidates for the flight program, and they were recruiting a lot of pilots during that time. And I think there were only occasional African American or Asian people that came through that program at the same time. So I really didn't know anybody who was openly gay until I was in my early 30s.
Wow. That's really that's a lot to deal with all at once.
Well, yeah, it was a different world, and as I look back, there were clues that I missed along the way about why it took me so long to figure it out, but I had no exposure to anything. In fact, I met with some of my colleagues who graduated from medical school, and I asked them if they had ever known that there were gay bars in Omaha at the time we were in medical school there, and none of them knew. And the reason for that was because at the time we were in medical school, being gay or homosexual, the word that was used at the time, was considered a pathologic deviancy. So if we had been caught in a gay bar at that time, we would have been thrown out of medical school as deviants. And so none of us would have taken that chance to be caught in that environment. It just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I actually recently saw a documentary called Scotty Bowers and the Secret History of Hollywood. And he was a man who did a lot of procuring for movie stars and people in the show business during the 40s and the 50s, and all the way through up until about 1980. And they had some stock footage of people being arrested in the 60s. Mm-hmm. Where raids would go on bars, and it was people lost their jobs, they lost everything, so I can imagine there was a lot of fear and a lot of repression.
Yes, there was. And also thinking back on that time, in the 1950s was the McCarthy era, when the government was purging the government of communists and homosexuals. And one of the things I did was to go back and look at the State Historical Society to see what our senator had said. And I can't quote it exactly, but basically what he said that if you're either a communist or a cocksucker, and it doesn't really make any difference because you can't tell the difference anyhow. And so, that was the air that we all were breathing in Nebraska at the time. And if you remember, Senator Craig getting caught in Idaho, he's the same age as I am. I was born in 1943. And when we were both 10, was when the Great Purge in Boise, Idaho happened. And there's a book called The Boys of Boise, and there were something like 1,000 men that were arrested, and there were a couple of them that were sent to prison during that period of time. So, even his statement that I'm not gay, I never have been gay, in my life makes some sense because he probably was exposed to the same kind of thing where the idea of being gay was so toxic that he couldn't have accepted it. So it was a whole different era that's hard for young people to reimagine.
Yes. I remember when he said that because he had actually a prefab family. And there's some other people, because I live in Chelsea, and
yeah,
it's a different world. But talking to younger people who they seem to think that a lot of gay history is actually a fable.
Oh, yeah.
I don't realize that these are actual events that happen to people.
Oh, yeah.
They take very much for granted their ability to walk hand in hand with each other, or just to blithely be as gay in terms of their mannerisms. That people had to be very, very self-conscious of, and it's a very different open world now, and a lot of it came from people who suffered a tremendous amount just to forge a path for everyone else. And we have to, I feel, we have to constantly remind younger people that this is not something that was easy for anybody.
Exactly. And, the scary part for me, Tim, is that I feel sometimes like we're on the edge of returning to that with some of the things that are going on politically right now. And I don't want to make this necessarily a political conversation, but I find it rather frightening. I mean, it wouldn't take much to go back to some of those things that we experienced during that era.
Yeah, I actually have interviewed several people who are trans. One is transitioning, and because of my podcasts, I've been getting contacted a lot through people, LinkedIn, who are advocates, and they're asking me to interview a number of other people who are trans to promote awareness, because it's just simply not they're simply not as visible as they need to be.
Yes.
And it's actually very hurtful and harmful to them. And I've taken part in a number of workplace advocacy conferences, and I just found myself attending a number of sessions that had to do with trans issues. So I think it has something to do with your body language once you become receptive, because I think that they see it on other people so hard and bitter against them, and once they see that you're receptive, the floodgates open, and you find yourself. It's like a cavalcade of people who you never would have been exposed to, who bring themselves forward to you, and you realize how much they struggle. So it's tremendous.
I worked for a while before I retired in a clinic that did some gender transitioning treatments. And so I saw quite a few of them, and it's much as you described. They suffer a lot right now. Yeah.
Yes.
Those who find it more difficult to pass, of course, struggle more, and those who make the transition later in life struggle more. But it's a terrible issue, and the amount of violence toward trans people is very high.
Yes, actually, one of the people who I know I worked with for years, she's a very large person. She was subjected to violence. She would come in occasionally to work with black eyes. I had the experience of walking behind her, coming back from lunch. This is between Madison and Park Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, and she would be walking a few steps or a few paces ahead of me, not knowing that I was behind her. And she would literally receive catcalls from loading docks. Just to walk a block home back to the office. So I know what I know. It's not. I can't speak firsthand, but having seen it,
it's real. It's very real. Yeah.
And this is within the last 10 years. This is just something that someone had to struggle with 50 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 20 years ago. This is something that it's ongoing, and it's very hurtful, and being made aware of it is heartbreaking.
I'm 75 now, Tim, and so a lot of what my work is involved in is advocacy for older LGBT, and it becomes a bigger issue again at the time of, for example, how do you place someone like that in a nursing home? Particularly if they're on state assistance, they're going to have a roommate in order. And we had a person that called me from Nebraska, probably 200 miles away, looking for a placement for a male to female, a trans person. They couldn't find a nursing home for him. Because nobody wanted to accept it. And I suppose that will get better over time, but it's still a major issue. And now that there are more and more of them, it's going to become more of an acute problem.
Yeah, I can see that very much, and it's a large concern, and I've been made aware of it. So I've doing what my share, I think. Hopefully, raise awareness and increase inclusion and acceptance. So, so I'm going to move on to the next question because I'm sure you have a great answer to this. Which life experience had the greatest impact on you?
Well, I have to say that my father's death, probably. My father was killed in a farm accident when I was 3. It was a tragic thing where there was a team of runaway horses, and he was trapped in the harnesses and drugged to his death beneath them. And the whole thing, I think, also fed into my difficulty in accepting that I was gay, because I always grew up with a sense that I had to figure out how to be a man. It didn't come naturally. We always talk about the sense of difference that a lot of people grow up with. Well, I had that, but I attributed that sense of not knowing how to be the kind of man I thought I should be. I always attributed that to my father's death. And if he had been here, he would have taught me how to be a man. But I didn't have that, and so it was kind of a go-to excuse in some ways. It also, of course, meant that my mother was left in a position of trying to survive supporting 4 kids at a time when women still weren't working very much. And so our family was fairly poor, and it had a really pretty significant impact on my whole life. And I remember searching for people to model myself after, but it's simply not the same. And it left a hole that it was difficult to fill. And there are people, I'm sure, who would say, "Oh, that's the reason he's gay, because he was searching for a man to fill that void in his life." I don't buy that at all. But I do feel that it was difficult for me to feel like a man, and that I actually felt more like a man after I came out as gay than I did before. And it's hard to describe that, but that obviously had a big impact. It also created sort of a fear of loss, that I was going to end up living a short time. He died when he was 32. That the year I was 32, I thought I was going to die. All those kinds of things that sort of recurrent. And fortunately, I survived it and got through that year. But I thought a lot about death. And now, of course, I'm old, and I've gotten, I've made it. You can't touch me now.
It's funny. I have one of my friends. I interviewed him too. He's Chinese. He grew up in Beijing, and he grew up in poverty too. He grew up in one room with his mother's father and his brother, and I think he said there was one bathroom for 22 families, and they had a little cooker on the outside in the hallway that they used. And he was never able to come out to his father until his father passed away before he was able to. But he's telling me how all sexuality is repressed in China. So the idea of identifying didn't occur to him until he was in his 20s.
Yeah.
And he was a foreign student. He came to America, came to Rutgers, and then he went to NYU. And but that's when his awareness became more important to him. Because as teenagers, no sexuality in China is for male and female, for straight and gay. They repress everything, which is it's just an amazing cultural difference.
Oh, yes. I've visited with some of the students over there as well, and it's not easy even now. We have to look at the geographical implications as well as the cultural implications of the coming out process, because it's so different. I mean, even in some of the very conservative or rural areas of the United States, it's just not an easy thing to do.
And even here, people are still, boys are still, there's a the pecking order, and there's a cruelty between straight people, and they assume that you're gay. When I went, I grew up on Long Island, and I went to a Catholic all boys high school, and I found it to be somewhat brutal. And I found out there was other people who were gay who were trying to give me hints, and I didn't get it. I look back and I go, oh man! I ran into several people in my 30s, and I got the list of who was, and then it went down. I started remembering things that people had said to me, and I was like, where was I? Well, I couldn't. It never dawned on me that someone had already figured out that I was gay, and they were trying to guide me to help me out a little bit.
I think that was one of the revelations that I came up with too, as I was going through the process of writing finally out, and that was that I had different situations where someone came on to me, and my initial response was well, panic for one thing, and then to be angry, and then why me? Why would somebody pick me out? Now, from the perspective I have at this point in my life, I can see that I was giving off clues that I didn't know.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about eye contact and holding a gaze longer than heterosexual men would, and that sort of thing. So I was inviting some of this stuff that I was so angry I was getting. So very difficult match. I had a very interesting experience in a shop in St. Louis once where a guy he kept touching me, and it was like, well, this guy's really clumsy, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, no, he's not, but it was, but I think it brings out the power of our minds to protect us from things we're not ready to accept. We have a very powerful ability to ignore clues that may seem so obvious to other people if it doesn't fit with the way we want to perceive ourselves.
Yeah, I call that turning a blind eye.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
So now I'm going to ask you a question. I think people have they always usually have a pretty good answer to this. What would you say to anyone interested in an aspect of your experience? Meaning, if someone wanted to explore an idea or prospective opportunity based on what you could tell them, what would be the main thing to encourage or discourage them?
I think that the major issue I would say is that life happens, and we all are going to have things that come up in our lives which are either heartbreaking or significant losses, and we have to get through that. But I think that people make a mistake if they live a life as a victim. It's important, I think, to not look toward others to feel good about yourself. You have to find that within yourself. And I encourage people to set their own goals and live their life in that way, and pursue their lives according to what is in their own best interest, I think, without paying a lot of attention to whether or not other people approve of what they're doing. Oh my God.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a pretty great answer, actually. So now, for you, considering you've such a tremendous experience in life, what would you say is your most noteworthy experience, your most noteworthy achievement?
I would have to say raising two daughters to become good parents. I was married for 18 years to my wife, and we had she also was raised in the same kind of community that I was, has a very similar background. And I often say that if marriages were arranged in the United States, our parents would have put us together. We were that matched, suited to each other. And she and I together had two daughters, and now they both are married, have raised their kids in ways that I find I'm very proud of what they've done. And so I think in many ways that's my proudest achievement.
That's awesome. I have a number of friends who have children that they had through heterosexual relationships. They came out during the course of their relationship, and they're very proud parents.
Yes.
I commend you, and I think that's something else. I haven't been there. I'm an uncle 7 times over, and I'm a great uncle. I'll be 11th time.
A gunkle.
Yeah. One of my nieces and nephews found out when I came out to them, it was a cultural commodity for them. They were, hey, uncle, they could tell them back to all the other kids. It was a big thing. It was cultural currency. That's what they called it.
Yeah, that's right.
So can I ask you now, because you, again, what is the biggest personal challenge you have faced? A personal injury, a seemingly overwhelming task, a personal professional goal, a difficult situation you had to overcome?
I think it relates to what we were just talking about, and that was the most difficult thing that I went through in that regard was letting go of the traditional values that I had inherited in that world that I grew up in, and then making a decision to divorce my wife and leave my children it was so contrary to everything that I believed was right for my life up until that point. And so it was this kind of predicament that I was in where staying looked bad, felt bad. On the other hand, leaving was also abandoning a value system that I had as I grew up. And that was a very difficult situation for me, probably the most difficult one in my life.
Yeah, I would imagine that. I told Purple a story that I had about 25 years ago. I had been trying to volunteer for everything from the hotline to a Big Brother type of thing. And in New York at the time, most of the people who were doing these things were graduate or postgraduate students. And it was a very tight circle, and they were very suspect of anybody's motives.
Uh-huh.
And I spoke to someone who I work with who was a few years older than me, who was gay, and it was my boss's boss. And he just looked at me and said, "Tim, don't believe in anybody who doesn't believe in you."
Yeah.
And I've taken that to heart since, from that moment, and it struck me.
It is interesting how little bits of conversation like that can change the course of our lives and the way that we see the world. I have a couple of things like that have happened to me as well. One was just a woman saying to me, "Loren, I always thought you'd be a doctor." Well, I mean, I had never even considered that was an option that might be available to me. So when she expressed that confidence, it was like, well, maybe so, maybe I can. And it was just a comment that she, kind of a throwaway comment for her, but for me, it was life-changing.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. Yeah, I imagine. So following up on that, what would you say was a transformational moment in your life? A meaningful gift, a reason to belong to something, being a parent, good job, bad job, or someone saying something to encourage you?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this ahead of time, and there are so many things that have been like that. But one, I think, major moment of that was when I told my mother I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And she said, "Well, why would you want to stop being a doctor?" Because her level of understanding, of course, was I was giving up her understanding of what being a doctor was. But the reason it was transformational for me was that it was the time that I felt this is right for me. I have to do it in spite of whether or not she approves or disapproves. And it was a time I began to think, I can choose my own course for my life, and I don't have to get approval from other people to do it. And that's why I found it so transformational.
Yes, I can see that when you shed all that, you jettison that the acceptance or the approval, disapproval of other people. That's something that's like more like window dressing afterwards.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is my I said this is my most trite question. Is that what drives you? What gets you up in the morning?
Well, at my age, I'm just glad I woke up. I think a lot of it, Tim, is the idea that as you get older, your time becomes your perception of time changes, and you begin to experience time instead of measuring it. It's not like what's on my schedule today. It's just like, thank God I'm alive. How can I use this in the best possible way? And so there is a kind of an urgency about sorting out how you're going to use your time, and letting go of things that are trivial or that aren't as meaningful. Letting go of maybe some friendships which are really valuable to you. I decided I would never sit through a bad lecture again, and I don't go to cocktail parties if I know I'm not going to like people. My time is valuable. So I think it's that sense of urgency about time, and knowing that it's limited and it's diminishing, and so it's important how I choose to use it. So that's what drives me. I want to make the best use of every day I can.
Well, that's excellent. I've had everything from people telling me that coffee gets them up in the morning to people telling me something.
Well, if you want to know the truth, it's my prostate that gets me up in the morning.
I've gotten notices.
but yeah, I didn't think about that, but I get up several times.
Okay, so we're going to move on to something else. I'm going to ask you, what's the first thing you want to come to people's minds when they think of you?
I like the fact that people say I have a warm smile and I have an infectious laugh. I am often told that my smile is engaging, and when I laugh, people know I'm in the room, and I value that.
That's terrific. That's not too far off from a lot of other people. The younger people, of course, they're very determined that people believe that they want to do something. They're sincere. If they're a good person.
Yeah.
And I think it's very commendable. As we get older, I think a lot of people assume that that's what people think of you.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Next question. What is your Zen?
Well, one of the things I've sort of alluded to as we've been talking about, but became real clear again when I was writing the book, is that seeking approval from other people is an addiction. And I don't mean that in a sort of a medical sense, but when we are dependent on approval from other people, we take a hit of that approval. We feel good for a moment, but it doesn't last long. We begin to crave it again, and we keep going back and back. And then when you do that, you put your life in somebody else's hands. They're in charge of you rather than being in charge of yourself. And so I think that one of the things as I matured was to learn that I don't have to be perfect. I was a good boy. I always did the right thing. And when my kids were young, I read something about being a good enough parent. And I thought, well, that takes me off the hook. I don't have to be a perfect parent. I just have to be good enough. And I've used that in so many other areas of my life too, just to feel like, if I do 80% on the important things, that's pretty good. If it's 50% on things that are not so important, that's okay too. But pursuing perfection is always leads to disaster. And the reason we do that is we're addicted to approval from other people, and it's no way to live our life.
That's interesting. I have a friend of mine who I worked with. We both worked on a team that eventually became, I don't know if you're familiar with Hulu.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of people we work with, we felt that they needed a constant sense of affirmation based on prior confirmation or confirmation bias. They're told that they're wonderful, so they're constantly seeking to put, to strike that lightning again.
Oh yes.
And it's virtually impossible, but they try to approximate it as much as possible. And I think that drives a lot of people to do some good things. But it also it stops them from accepting reality when things aren't going to work out the way they want them to. They'll try to find a way to turn it in their mind to an asset.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I see a lot of people as a psychiatrist who are seeking approval from other people and base their relationships on that, and can't understand why they're not happy. But they're not happy because they're not being true to themselves and who they want to be, and they've put other people in charge of their life.
Yeah. Really, and if they're lucky enough, they can surround themselves with enough people that
Yeah.
But most of us have to struggle.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so now this is a question that I have wildly different answers on this, but I think virtually everyone, especially anybody who's gay, has crossed the threshold, and that's the point of no going back. You can't, and you know it. And how did you know when you arrived there? How did it feel to cross it? What was the significance to you? What did you leave behind? What are you glad you left behind? And what do you regret leaving behind?
It's a lot of questions in one there. And I think when I wrote about it in the book, I said that I suddenly turned gay when somebody kissed me. Because I had sort of sexual fantasies with same-sex kinds of things, but had not really acted much on it. But I never really thought that men kissed, And then when it happened, there was this moment when all of a sudden it was like the not just the erotic elements, but the psychological elements all came together, and I felt like I was finally experiencing for the first time what other guys had been talking about through the years, when they would talk about their experiences. And so that became kind of a transformational moment for me as well. I think in the process of all of that, and sort of what I've alluded to before, is that what I had to do was leave behind that value system that I had grown up with and inherited and had never questioned. And I needed to begin to deconstruct that and then begin to reconstruct a value system which was consistent with really the way I saw the world at the time. And that, I think, was the thing that gave me a sense of peace and authenticity and a sense that I am who I am, and it's okay that I am. And like it or don't, it doesn't matter. It's not going to change the person I want to be.
Well, I can understand that. I always say a lot of people, when we wonder, in the moment of liberation, they threw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of morality. And, you have to construct something. I have one of my friends who I've also interviewed as a former evangelical Christian.
Oh, yeah.
He had to come to a tremendous amount of reconciliation when he left that behind, and he had to find out all the basic tenets that he knew that they were part of who he was and his construction of his psyche and everything was still there. They just weren't attached to something that was an absolute that he left behind. So that's a very similar experience to a lot of other people, and I was very surprised at how similar his experience was, leaving that behind as it is to come out and to reconstruct or construct your own morality.
Yeah, it's very difficult to leave that behind when it's been. Well, you grew up in Catholic schools. You know that you were taught that there is a right and a wrong, and there isn't any nuance or ambiguity about that. There is absolute right and wrong, and as long as you accept that that's the way the world is, again, someone else is doing your thinking for you. It's not your own thought that determines those values.
Yes, it's very easy. You don't have to.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I think, cling to it for that because they don't. There isn't a lot of decision making. They don't have to struggle with those kinds of conflicts about whether it's right or wrong because somebody's already defined it for them.
Yes, there's a lot of serenity, I think, for a lot of people to find that. And
didn't work well for me.
Okay, so now we've gone through my 10 questions. Now I'd like to know which questions have you chosen?
Well, you mentioned one about a turning point in my life, and the one that came to mind was when I was 9 years old. My brother, who was 16, was in a car accident, and he ended up becoming a quadriplegic at that time. And he was one of those people who jumps out of airplanes with no legs, that kind of a person who, he didn't do that, but he rode a raft down the river in the Bahamas as a quadriplegic, and he traveled throughout the world. He had his own business. He did, and the reason that was such an important thing for me was, he had his limitations, but he never lived by those limitations. He lived based on what was left, what he had left. And so I thought, well, I've got gifts. I better use them if I've got them as well. And that was another turning point in my life, I think. And he was an impressive guy, not an easy person to have as a big brother. you know, you know. Yeah. So that was an important thing.
It's terrific. That is inspiring, actually.
Yeah.
Next question for you.
Regrets. I would say no, I don't have any. I don't like to look at my life in retrospect and act. And I trust that the decisions I made at the time I made them were made with the best information I had at the time. So why should I try and go back and undo those things and wish that I had done them a different way? I feel sad that my coming out hurt my wife and my kids. I feel sad about that, but I still think that it was the right decision, and it would have been wrong to stay. So, and I just don't think there's a lot of use in regretting the way we've lived our lives.
Well, I have a friend of mine who came out to his wife. I think he has 2 daughters as well. And it was a whole lot less forgiving and understanding experience. I think she was quite angry with him, and I don't think he has any regrets about that. I think, but he did have it was a bit volatile. So I think that kind of firmed up his resolve. Because
exactly. I'm actually doing some work now with Straight Spouse Network and trying to bridge the gap between spouses who've been left behind by people when they come out, and there is a real disconnect there, because we have those of us who've been married in heterosexual marriages struggle for a long time often before we make a decision to leave. But then it's new information for that spouse, and a lot of times anyhow. And so they're just beginning the process of going through that and reconstructing their life based on that at a time when we've got grades that are celebrating our place, and they feel abandoned and alone. And so it's a very difficult thing for them to have this dumped in their life. So I'm looking forward to doing some more work with them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done with it. He still has acrimony.
Absolutely.
It's been quite some time too, and the way he describes it is a little bit more circumspect.
Yeah,
it's been made very clear to me that it was a hostile experience. So,
in some ways, I think the hostility when it's first there is important, because it sort of validates your decision to do it. But then I think you have to move beyond that if you can. I'm fortunate. I've been divorced now for 33 years, and I still have a good relationship with my wife. And I call her my wife because she's the only one I ever had. And I get together with her, and she and my husband are good friends. So it's worked out about as good as it possibly could for anyone. But it doesn't just happen. You have to work at it to make that happen. And you begin to work toward forgiveness and acceptance of the reality of the way the world is. And so I guess that's one message I'd like to try and tell people, is that it can change. When kids reject their fathers or mothers because they've come out, don't give up on them. Try and persist in maintaining whatever limited of a relationship you have. Send them a postcard occasionally. Tell them that you're thinking about them, and hope that at some point it will begin to change. But you can't just walk away and expect them to come back to you.
Yeah, no. I think they manage, and some everyone else, I think, is still raising the children together. So It's a matter of reconciliation, and then over the course of time, I think the things mellow and people do have conversations, as opposed to the initial resentment or the feelings of betrayal or whatever that is. It's very strong, and it did take some time. And I think for some people it was easy, or wasn't as difficult or as prolonged, and other people is something that was a little bit more difficult for their spouse to
Absolutely
to recover. So what we got? It's the next one.
Well, you asked a question about memories, and I've gone through a bunch of them. I suppose the only thing that I haven't really talked about were, well, a couple of things. One was my relationship with Doug. I've been married to Doug now. We've been together 32 years, and I knew within 24 hours that he was the right person to be with. And I think that one of the things that I just was reading the book Blink about our ability to thin slice information and make decisions which seem impulsive with very little information. And I think it was a good decision that I made on a fairly impulsive at the time, but we've made it work. It hasn't always been easy, but you have to fight for it. I mean, I think as we get older, we realize that relationships all start off on a high note and then go through some very difficult and challenging times. And sometimes if you fight your way through it, it can get to a higher place again. And I would say that that's a description of the way that Doug and I have approached ours. I think the other thing in terms of memories was I had an experience when I spoke to a group in Houston. And when I was done, this man raised his hands in the air and he said, "I'm 82 and this is the best time of my life." And that was another one of those experiences that changed my life. And I thought, well, what does he know that I need to figure out? Because I was, younger and I wasn't feeling so good about being the age I was. And that's a whole nother story. I mean, that we could go into for an hour or so. But I struggled. And at some point, I began to recognize that there's an emptiness in always striving to climb the ladder one rung higher, that sometimes where you get to is high enough. And as long as you're preoccupied with that, always achieving at a higher level, you sacrifice a lot of things. And as I mentioned, when you're older and you see that time is important, some of those things don't seem so much. I mean, I've got a drawer full of rewards that at one time were important to me, but are sort of meaningless to me now, and so sometimes we've been striving for things which may not have been that important. In the long run.
It seemed important at the time.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
It changes. Yes. Absolutely. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're at number 14.
Okay.
What question would you like to address?
One of the things is what direction is my life headed? Again, if we go back to, I was born in 1943. Life expectancy for a male child born in 1943 was 63 years. So I've had a gift of basically 12 additional years that were not, I couldn't have expected when I was born. And now, because I'm 75, I'm considered a survivor, and my life expectancy is like 87. So I've been given a gift of about 20, 25 years potentially that I couldn't have expected. And I feel that that's a gift that I have to share with others, that I want to use my time to share in whatever ways that I can be useful to other people.
Well, that's pretty good. I don't know. My father just passed away a few weeks ago.
I'm sorry.
He was 95, and one of the things that people are, especially younger people, because they're all in love with being young, is that there's just, wow, that's so great, he made it that far. And but keep in mind, it's very difficult to be old.
Yeah.
And, it's not easy, and especially when everybody else goes and everything hurts, and you've got a tremendous amount of issues. So whatever you can do to savor it and to optimize it while you have the time is absolutely something I can't endorse or stress enough. It's a great thing to do. So if you've got, you're aware of this, you're going to do a lot more than anybody who's passive.
Yeah, I think so. I talk some when I speak to groups about the opportunities of aging, and there are some. We don't often use those words together, but there are some things that come with it, and part of it is a freedom to really be the person we want to be, and not waste time on things that are not really important. And I'm okay with being 75. I started telling people I was 75 before I was 75. It's like a child who's like, I'm almost 5. I felt the same kind of thing. When I was 60, I lied the other way.
My husband does that all the time. He tells everybody he's like 6 months older than he is. We've been together. January will be 28 years, and it's very similar to what you said. Within the first, I think the first hour, I had an idea, and we had a back and forth for a few weeks, and but I was kind of dogged, and then I got cold feet, and then it goes back and forth.
Yeah.
But he does the same thing too. I was yelled at by a doctor because I did that. She said, "You are not that old yet." So I said, "Don't say you." I said, "Okay." And she kind of drilled that into my head. So I'm 58. I'll be 58 until my 50th birthday. So now we're up to 15.
One of the other questions you had was, is there anything you would change about yourself? And I think based on what I've been saying, there probably isn't much, except I have man boobs, and when I was about 60, I saw a plastic surgeon, and I had a breast reduction done. But if there's a God, I think she wanted me to have boobs because they kind of came back. And so I think if there's one thing I would change, for me it became sort of a metaphor for the lack of confidence I had about myself as masculine. It symbolized all that self-doubt that I have, and it was. I once had a coach. I played football, and the coach said in front of the entire football team, "Olson, with tits like that, you ought to be wearing a bra." And I still haven't forgiven him for that, because it was so humiliating. It really picked on a vulnerability that I felt, and it's been hard to get over. But I think that's probably about all I would change about myself. I'm satisfied with the rest.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. You come to mind Seinfeld with George's father. I don't know if you've ever seen the episode between Kramer and George Costanza's father, where they discussed this, and they came up with the men's support garment. They called it either the bro or the man's ear. And it was very, very funny.
An early version of man spanks. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely. This is over 20 years ago. So
yeah, that's funny. Apparently, I'm not the only one who struggled with that.
Actually, they even had one of the people that they knew was a man who worked in the brassiere industry, and he said, "I too." And his name, they were going to develop this. So it was one of those very funny experience. So now we're up to 16.
I think what are your baseline criteria for satisfaction? I think a few things come to mind. Belonging to a sense of community, having friends that you see frequently that accept you, and then having one person that you can just be entirely deep and personal with, that you know is not going to walk away. They'll walk through that pain with you. I mean, I think those are the things that are important to me and give my life satisfaction and meaning.
Wow, that's really cool. Okay, so now we're up to 17th question.
Yeah, tell me about your dog, or my relationship to the animal kingdom. Yeah, I have always loved dogs, and it was almost a deal breaker in my relationship with Doug, because he is a passionate gardener, and dogs and gardens often don't go well together. And I thought I might have to choose a dog over Doug, because I just couldn't imagine living without him. But he's come around now. He's as crazy about them as I am, and we've had as many as 5 at one time before. Yeah, now we just have one. But yeah, I love him to death. I can walk to the mailbox and come home, and he's happy to see me like I'd been gone for 2 weeks. There's never any sense of lack of loyalty. So I love him to death.
We're both cat people, and we just lost our kitty he was a little over 17 years, and so we had him since he was a kid, and we took him home, and we love animals as well.
Yeah. So. Doug says he has a drawer full of the cremains from all of our pets. Yeah, because he can't afford to part with them yet. So we've been through it with a number of our animals.
Yeah, we feel the same way. We have a hard time. We still feel his presence.
Yeah,
we do, and we don't want to let go.
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult, but I tell people, go out and get another one. It's not like you're doing a disservice to the other one to do that. It's just telling you that you love something so much that you can't deal without having it in your life. And I don't think you have to wait a certain length of time. At least I couldn't. I'd be out to the rescue league right away.
Well, we got him from a rescue, and I think we're just taking a little break. But we're I think as soon enough we'll pick another one. And it will be a kitten. It won't be somebody who absolutely needs us. Yeah. And everybody I know, my brother and his wife had 2 rescues, and there's a moment of truth when you first realize, and he told me, he says, you told me, but I never realized until they looked you in the eye and you saw that face that needs you.
Yeah.
You realize you have to be there. You have to take care of them, and then you can't believe how much you fall in love with them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how they become just a part of our soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
It's great. It's just tremendous. It's a different thing than having a kid. It's this soulmate or this little pal. You got the best pal in the whole wide world.
Oh yeah.
Just because I couldn't. He was just there constantly. I wouldn't have to lean my head back, and he'd be right behind me.
Yeah, I understand that completely. Yeah. Reggie, my dog, if we're laying down, he's got to touch me somewhere, and that's nice. That's really nice.
Very wonderful. So now we're at 19?
Is there anything you struggle with that you wish I didn't struggle with?
Yeah.
Saying no. I have difficulty because I find a lot of things interesting. And when people want me to do something, I think, that'd be fun. And then I can get overextended. So I wish I could say no more easily at times when Or at least I'll think about it and I'll get back to you. That's what I guess is the best one. I'll get back to you about that, and then you never do, I need to rehearse that a little more.
Okay, that's a good one. I haven't heard that before. So I'm going to ask you the last one, but then I'm going to ask you just one bonus question afterwards that I ask everybody as a little one afterwards. But what's your 20th question?
It's actually one that I pretty much have talked about before, and that is what's the biggest boost to your self-esteem? I think my self-esteem is related to being the person I want to be. I know the kind of person I want to be, and as long as I feel like I'm on track with that, my self-esteem is in check.
Well, that's great. Okay, that is in line with a lot of everything you said before. So that kind of wraps it all up. Okay, so that's great. So that does wrap up the 20 questions with interesting people. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It has been. I wish I could have had my camera on, because I enjoy being. I'm glad that I was able to see you, because we seem to have a similar sense of humor, and that's been real fun. It's been a pleasure to connect with you.
Well, I thank you so much. And as I always end the show, I say, as the kiddies say, peace out.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.